I think this is the most dramatic chess game played this year. It was played at the Norway Chess Classic. Today, as of this recording, Alireza Firouzja with black, Magnus Carlsen with white. And this game has back and forths and things you would never see in a game between these two players. Truly amazing chess. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with e4. Firouzja plays c5. The Sicilian defense, going for an unbalanced game where you play for a win with the black pieces. Knight to f3. Looks like he's going to play the open Sicilian with d4 here, but Magnus has a surprise, one of many surprises in this game. e6 was played by Firouzja, and Magnus plays bishop to d3. That's the 15th most commonly played move in this position, blocking his own d-pawn. I think the idea long-term is to play c3, bishop c2, and then advance to d4, but a very odd choice. And Firouzja comes out immediately. He doesn't play a casual approach to this. He plays knight to c6, castles, and g5. The queen controls the g5 square, and he's already threatening to gain space on the king side because this pawn blocks the bishop, so the g5 square is not controlled. He takes advantage of that, aiming to kick the knight away from f3 and gain space. Bishop goes to b5, and already on the fifth move, we have a completely fresh position. At least in my database, they are already, fifth move was a novelty in a completely new position. Bishop to g7, played by Firouzja. Bishop takes c6. Magnus gives up the bishop pair, but in turn cripples Firouzja's pawn structure. bc6, he captures toward the center. d3, now he is aiming at the pawn on g5. The pawn advances to g4, kicks the knight, knight f to d2. The c4 square might be a good place for that knight to settle later. And h5 to protect the pawn on g4. And he has this nice group of pawns on the king side. Firouzja's big problem here, however, is the king in the middle of the board. He has to do something about this king on e8. It could get in real danger as the game progresses. The knight goes to b3, attacks the pawn on c5. d6 is played. Now f4, gaining space on the king side, and black does definitely not want to take that pawn en passant. This would be a mistake. After queen f3, white's pieces are lining up very nicely against the vulnerable f7 square. So instead, Firouzja plays knight to e7. He knows this f5 square is important. White would love to play f5 and maybe break open that f file. So he wants to keep that square under control, and he has the knight, the pawn, and the bishop at c8 doing that job right now. Bishop to d2, hanging the b2 pawn, and the rook on a1. What is Magnus thinking? Well, Firouzja takes the pawn on b2. Magnus plays bishop to a5, attacking the black queen, so black has to deal with that first. The queen goes to d7, the knight goes to d2, and here's a little question for you, a strategic question. Which piece is more valuable, the rook on a1 or the bishop on b2? Now, we know rooks are worth more than bishops in an abstract sense. People will say, well, bishop's worth 3 points, or rook is worth 5 points, or whatever point system. But that only is true in a theoretical sense. You have to take the position on the board when you're making a decision about which is the most valuable piece. Magnus is clearly willing to part with that rook to get that bishop. And Firouzja agrees. And he retreats the bishop back to g7. He says, I don't want your rook. My dark square bishop is more important than that rook. Well, what if he had taken the rook? After queen a1, Magnus would have a very strong position. That queen attacking that rook, say, defends with the knight. Queen goes to g7, queen e7, knight c4. He's coming in on this d6 square after queen f8, queen to c3. After a move like f5, black is probably just lost here. White's position is ferocious. So both sides, of course, see that and do not play into that. Firouzja brings the bishop back. Queen to e1. The queen could come to h4, but Magnus also is supporting a potential e5 push in the center. Bishop to a6, putting the bishop on really the only diagonal it has any activity on of any kind. Rook goes to d1, and now f5. This is important because Magnus wants to play f5. So black plays f5 first. This is a common way of dealing with a potential f5 break in a Sicilian. Black plays it first with the knight supporting it on e7. e5 is played, so he gains space with the e-pawn. The knight goes to g6 to put pressure on the e5 and f4 pawns. The knight goes to c4 to counteract that, and also threatening to take on d6, quite a serious threat. So black has to take that knight off of the board. It's just too strong there. Pawn takes. Now the rook on d1 is perfectly positioned, putting pressure on the queen and the d6 pawn. d5 is played. Really the only effective way to deal with that. Knight takes c5. So Magnus regains his pawn, and he hits the queen, and his pieces are starting to get some real activity. And remember, Firouzja's king is still in the middle of the board. That's an issue. The queen goes to c8, knight to b3, and here the best move for black, computers show us, is bishop to f8, but Firouzja makes a very natural move. He castles. Now, look at this bishop on a5 and this knight on b3. They don't look that well placed. They're on the side of the board. They're decentralized. Watch how Magnus handles these minor pieces, and look where they end up in the span of just a very few moves. First, he plays bishop to b4, aiming at the rook. So the rook moves. Now bishop to d6. He takes the rook from a5 to d6, puts it right in the heart of Firouzja's position. Queen to a6, aiming at the c4 pawn. Queen to c3, defending. Black does not want to take, because the queens would just exchange after knight c5. White is much better. These pawns are incredibly weak, so he wouldn't do that. So after queen to c8, a queen to c3, rook a to d8 is played, and now c5, setting up the strong point on d4 for his knight. After bishop h6, Firouzja attacks f4 twice, so Magnus has to defend it. Rook to d7 and knight to d4. Now look at these minor pieces. They were at a5 and b3. Now that bishop is just locked in at d6. Magnus's knight radiating power all over the board at d4, and there's just no question about it. Magnus is winning, but don't go anywhere. I said this was a dramatic game, right? Well, get ready. Magnus is winning it. No one can really envision Magnus Carlsen failing to win this game at this point. People were just basically, counting down the seconds and minutes until Alireza resigned. Well, we'll see about that. He plays rook to f7, trying to keep the f5 square strong, because one of the strategies with these locked structures is the other side will sacrifice a piece for a couple of pawns. He's making that really impossible for white to do. It's just the best he can come up with, really. Rook to b1 puts the rook on the open file. h4 trying to generate some pressure on g3 and f4. Queen to d3. If you exchange queens, white's easily winning. He's attacking e6, c6, and after rook b3, a3, the a7 pawn. This is just easy pickings for Magnus. So Firouzja avoids that exchange. Instead, he plays the queen to a4, a3, and a5. Rook f to d1. Magnus is completely dominating. And everyone in the chat while this game was going on was talking about how Firouzja should resign. The commentators were saying basically anything Magnus would play in this position is winning. And that was the tone of things at this point in the game. hg3, hg3. And here Firouzja plays bishop takes f4. Now, this isn't a great move, but it's at least a way to generate some complications. Maybe he can get Magnus, off of this game if he makes a sacrifice, which he does. That hits the queen, so the queen goes to b3. And now queens have to be exchanged. There's just nowhere else for the black queen to go. Queen takes b3, and rook takes b3. Magnus has control of the b file. He doesn't want to block that by taking with the c pawn. a4 hits the rook. The rook goes to b4, and Firouzja plays rook to h7, hoping beyond hope that he might find some activity down the h file. The rook goes to f1, hitting the knight on f4. That knight goes to h3 with check. King g2, now the knight goes to g5. And here Magnus plays knight to c6, getting some material. Computers recommend rook a4 as the better move. That way this knight stays centralized and would help control the f3 square a little bit, but the knight takes c6. Now the knight goes to e4, and Magnus, again, should probably just play knight to d4 and re-centralize that knight, but he makes a very committal decision here. He gives up the exchange, he plays rook takes e4. And I'm sure he had calculated this well, but it turns out if Firouzja makes a series of only moves, just perfect moves in a certain sequence, he has a chance to save the game. And this is the first point in which that's the case. If he takes with the f-pawn, white is completely winning. After knight to d4, rook h3, c6, I mean, the pawn advances, and he's just going to completely, white is just winning here. So he has to take with the d-pawn, and he does. Now, why is this different? It's different because this clump of pawns on the king side can be used against Magnus's king, perhaps create mating threats or mating nets. So he captured with the correct pawn at that point. He had to, or he would have just been lost. The knight goes back to d4, rook to h3. Black would love to activate this second rook. Alireza would play king g7, rook to h8, and get both rooks active. c6, king to f7, plays c7, and rook e to h8. And now Alireza has gotten his second rook into the game, gone from a completely losing position now to a very competitive game. The knight goes to c6, rook h2, king g3, and by the way, it'll be a blunder for black to play rook 8 to h3 check. That looks like the most aggressive move, but it actually would not work. After, say, king to f4, rook to f3, he could just play king to g5. He didn't even have to worry about this rook on f1. If he were to take it, promoting to a queen here would just win for white. There's nothing he could do. King g7, queen to d7, and mate would be soon. So he can't do that. What he does instead is play rook takes c2. Definitely the better move. Hits the knight, adds some more protection to the c8 square. And as it turns out, Magnus has a move here, a move that keeps the game equal. If he doesn't play it, Firouzja gets an advantage. And it's this move, rook to h1, distracting the rook on h8 from the queening square. Very hard move to find, and he did not find it. This is definitely a computer move, but would have been really amazing if he had found it. So Magnus instead plays knight to d8 check, again a natural move, king to g6, knight takes e6, rook to h3 check, and we can see Magnus's king is in trouble. We also see why it was so important to keep these pawns together. King to f4, rook to f3 check, rook takes rook, and again, black's next move is the difference between winning and losing. If Alireza plays the right move, he's winning. If he plays the wrong move, he's losing. The bad move is gf3. That would have been a blunder, because after king to g3, Magnus would be winning. Let's say knight to f2, knight f4 check, king h7, king g2, e3, and knight to d3. This is a key square for the knight. From d3, it controls the rook going to c1, but it also supports a bishop going to c5 and blocking the rook's access to the pawn and the queening square. So d3 was key. King to g6, and then bishop to c5. Excuse me, and here Magnus is just winning. So Firouzja has to play ef3, and he does. Again, brilliant. ef3, king to g3, and in this position, there is only one winning move. That move is f2. And the reason that move is winning is because after, say, knight f4 check, king h7, promote to a queen, here, Firouzja would actually promote to a knight with check. And when the king moves, you take the queen, and he would be up and exchange. If instead king to g2, then g3, knight to f4 check, king h7, knight to d5, and what Magnus wants to do is play the knight to e3. If, say, rook to c1, knight to e3, and white is in very good shape, the knight is perfectly placed, but after knight to d5, black could play f4, controlling that square, and when the knight takes the pawn, now it's no longer on a circuit where it can land on the e3 square, and after rook to c1, the pawn is queening, and Firouzja would win. But after making perfect move after perfect move after perfect move, here he makes the second best move, which is rook to g2 check. And after a very dramatic back and forth game, there is a repetition here. Actually, it's a perpetual check, and the draw is agreed. And you have to stay with this perpetual because if Firouzja, say, tried to go after the pawn with rook to c2, then knight to f4 check, king h6, and again knight to d3, the knight would end up on that ideal square, controlling c1 and blocking the rook's access to the queening square. A very dramatic game, and you would have thought, no way Magnus would not win that position, but Firouzja made his job incredibly tough and played brilliantly. In the Armageddon game after this, Magnus did win, but that was only worth half a point out of 3, so Firouzja did a good job of minimizing his losses in this game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.